Last time we spoke about the Battle of Suishan, Zhaoyang, Shantou. Following the brutal 1938 capture of Wuhan, Japanese forces aimed to solidify their hold by launching an offensive against Chinese troops in the Fifth War Zone, a rugged natural fortress in northern Hubei and southern Henan. Under General Yasuji Okamura, the 11th Army deployed 3 divisions and cavalry in a pincer assault starting on May the 1st of 1939, targeting Suishan and Zhaoyang to crush nationalist resistance and secure flanks. Li Zhongren, leveraging terrain like the Daibei and Tongbei Mountains, orchestrated defenses with over 200,000 troops, including Tang Embo's 31st Army Group. By May 23rd, they recaptured Suishan and Zhaoyang, forcing a Japanese withdrawal with heavy losses, over 13,000 Japanese casualties versus 25,000 for the Chinese, restoring pre-battle lines. Shifting further south, Japan targeted Shantou and Guangdong to sever supply lines from Hong Kong. In a massive June 21st amphibious assault, the 21st Army overwhelmed thin Chinese defenses, capturing the port and Chaoan despite guerrilla resistance by Zhang Fakui. Though less mounted, Japan tightened its blockade, straining China's war effort amidst ongoing attrition. This episode is From Changkufeng to Nomonhan. Hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Etcheson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also use this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, we just started 2 mini-series covering the Taiping Rebellion and the 7 Years' War. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Yes, hello again, and yes, you're probably guessing by now that we're taking another detour. And do not worry, I'm going to shorten this one considerably. It won't be like the last time when we were talking about the Battle of Changkufeng, also known as the Battle of Lake Khasan. What we're about to jump into is known, well, to the West as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. By the Japanese, it would be known as the Nomonhan Incident. But before we jump into this colossal event, I first need to set up the table, so to say. So turning the clock back to August the 10th of 1938, the Litvinov-Shigemitsu Agreement established a joint border commission, who were tasked with redemarking the disputed boundary between the Soviet Union and the Japanese-controlled puppet state of Manchuria. However, this commission never really achieved a mutually agreeable definition of the border in the contested area. In reality, the outcome was decided well before the group's inaugural meeting. Mere hours after the ceasefire took effect on the afternoon of August 11th, General Grigory Stern convened a regimental commander from Japan's 19th Division to coordinate and disengage the forces. With the conflict deemed honorably concluded, Japan's Imperial General Headquarters mandated the swift withdrawal of all Japanese troops to the western bank of the Tumen River. By the night of August 13th, as the final Japanese soldier crossed the river, it effectively became the de facto border. Soviet forces promptly reoccupied Changkufeng Hill and the adjacent heights, a move that would carry unexpected and profound repercussions. Japanese High Command analyzed the event and suggested that if negotiations in Moscow had dragged on for just one more day, the 19th Division would have likely been dislodged from Changkufeng and its surrounding elevations. Undoubtedly, General Stern's infantry breathed a sigh of relief as the bloodshed ceased. Yet one can't help but question why Moscow opted for a ceasefire at the juncture when the Soviet troops were on the cusp of a total battlefield triumph. Perhaps Kremlin leaders deemed it wiser to settle for a substantial gain, roughly 3/4 of their objectives, rather than risk everything. Moscow may have been wary of provoking a broader Asian conflict. Another theory posits that Soviet high command was misinformed about the ground situation. Reports of capturing a small segment of Changkufeng's crest might have been misinterpreted as control over the entire ridge, or an imminent full takeover before midnight on August 10th. The unexpected phone call from Foreign Minister Maxim Nifanov to the Japanese embassy that night, proposing a 1-kilometer Japanese retreat in exchange for a ceasefire along the existing lines, hinted at communication breakdowns between Stern's headquarters and the Kremlin. Ironically, such lapses may have preserved Japanese military honor, allowing the 19th Division's evacuation through diplomacy rather than defeat. After all was said and done, both sides endured severe losses. Initial Japanese press reports claimed about 158 killed and 740 wounded. However, the 19th Division's medical logs reveal quite a grimmer toll. About 526 dead, 914 injured, with a total of 1,440 casualties. The true figure may have climbed even higher, possibly 1,500 to 2,000. Following the armistice, the Soviet news agency TSS reported 236 Red Army fatalities and about 611 wounded. Given Stern's uphill assaults across open terrain against entrenched positions, these numbers seem understated. Attackers in such scenarios typically suffer 2 to 3 times the defender's losses, suggesting Soviet casualties range from 3 to 5,000. This also aligns with the Soviet Military Council investigation on August 31st of 1938, which documented about 408 killed and 2,807 wounded. Hell, the Japanese estimated that the Soviets' losses were something like 7,000. Not all victims perished in combat. Marshal Vasily Blyukher, a decorated Soviet commander, former warlord of the Far East, and Central Committee candidate, was summoned to Moscow in August of 1938. Relieved of duty in September and arrested with his family in October, he faced charges of inadequate preparation against Japanese aggression and harboring, quote, enemies of the people within his ranks. On November the 9th of 1938, Blyukher died during interrogation, which was an old Soviet euphemism for torture-induced death. Other innocents suffered as well. In the wake of the fighting, Soviet authorities deported hundreds of thousands of Korean rice farmers from the Ussuri region to Kazakhstan. Talk about a culture shock there. They were aiming to eradicate the Korean settlements that Japanese spies had allegedly exploited. The Changkufeng clash indirectly hampered Japan's Wuhan offensive, a massive push to subdue China at the time. The influx of troops and supplies for this campaign was briefly disrupted by the border flare-up. Notably, Kwantung Army's 2nd Air Group, slated for Wuhan, was retained due to the Soviet threat. Chiang Kai-shek's drastic measure, breaching the Yellowdike River to flood the Japanese advance routes, further delayed the assault. By October the 25th of 1938, when Japanese forces had captured Hankou, Chiang Kai-shek had relocated his capital to the distant Chongqing. Paradoxically, Wuhan's fall cut the railway links from Guangzhou Island, heightening Chiang Kai-shek's reliance on Soviet aid, routed over land and by air from Central Asia. Japan secured a tactical win, but missed the decisive blow. Chinese resistance persisted, pinning down 1 million Japanese troops in occupational duties. But what was the true significance of Changkufeng? For General Kwezo Sutaka and the 19th Division, it evoked a mix of bitterness and pride. Those eager for combat got their fair share, though not on their own terms. To veterans mourning fallen comrades on those desolate slopes, it might have felt like a senseless tragedy. Yet they fought valiantly, under very dire conditions, holding firm until a retreat that blended humiliation with imperial praise, a bittersweet inheritance. For the Red Army, it marked a crucial trial of resolve amid Stalin's purges. While Stern's forces didn't shine brilliantly, they acquitted themselves well in adversity. The U.S. military attaché in Moscow observed that any purge-related inefficiencies had been surmounted, praising the Red Army's valor, reliability, and in their equipment. His counterpart in China, which was Colonel Joseph Stilwell, yes, Vinegar Joe, put it bluntly. The Soviets appeared to advantage, and he urged skeptics to rethink notions of the weakened Red Army. Yet by World War II's eve, many British, French, German, and Japanese leaders still dismissed the Red Army as a paper tiger. Soviet leaders appeared content, promoting Stern to command the Transbaikal Military District, and he was also made Colonel General by 1940, while honoring heroes of the Lake Khasan battle. They got many medals. In a fiery November 7th of 1938 speech, Marshal Clement Voroshilov warned that future incursions would prompt strikes deep into enemy territory. Tokyo's views diverged sharply. Many in the military and the government saw it as a stain on the Imperial Army's prestige, especially the Kwantung Army, who were humiliated on Manchukuoan soil, and it was the soil they were sworn to protect. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, yes, that complete asshole, if you listen to the Pacific War series, you know what I'm getting at. Well, he framed it as a successful reconnaissance, confirming Soviet border defenses without broader aggression, allowing the Wuhan push to proceed safely. We will be talking about him in this quite a bit. Critics, including Major General Gun Hashimoto and some historians, question this. They argued if Imperial General Headquarters lacked contingency plans for massive Soviet responses, especially with Wuhan preparations underway since June. One expert warned Japan that they had played with fire, risking Manchuria and Korea if escalation occurred. Yet Japanese commanders gleaned few lessons, downplaying Soviet material superiority and maintaining disdain for the Red Army prowess. The 19th Division's stand against outnumbered odds reinforced their hubris, as did tolerance for local insubordination, attitudes that would prove very costly in the future. The Kremlin, conversely, learned Japan remained unpredictable despite its China quagmire. But for Emperor Hirohito's intervention, the conflict might have ballooned. Amidst Purges and the Czech crisis, Stalin likely viewed it as a reminder of Eastern vulnerabilities, especially with Munich advancing German threats westward. Both sides toyed with peril. Moderation won in Tokyo, but the Kwantung Army seethed. On August 11th, Premier Fumimaro Konoe noted the need for further caution. The Kwantung Army, however, pushed for and secured control of the disputed salient from the Joseon Army by October 8th of 1938. Even winter's chill couldn't quench their vengeful fire, setting the stage for further confrontations. Now, a quick look at any regional map reveals how Manchukuo and the Mongolian People's Republic each jut into another's territory like protruding salients. These bulges could be seen as rather aggressive thrusts into enemy land, yet they also risked encirclement absorption by the opposing empire. A northward push from western Manchuria through Mongolia could sever the MPR and the Soviet Far East from the USSR's heartland. Conversely, a pincer movement from Mongolia and Soviet maritime provinces might envelop and isolate Manchukuo. This dynamic highlights the frontier's strategic volatility in the 1930s. And one particularly tense sector was the broad Mongolian salient extending about 150 miles eastward into the west-central parts of Manchukuo. There in mid-1939, Soviet-Japanese tensions erupted into a hell of a conflict. It was known to the Japanese as the Nomonhan Incident, and to the Soviets and Mongolians as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. This clash would absolutely dwarf the earlier Changkufeng affair. It would span 4 months, it would claim 30,000 to 50,000 casualties, it would amount to a small undeclared war, and it would be the modern era's first limited conflict between two great powers. Now, the Mongolian salient features vast, semi-arid plains of sandy grassland, gently rolling terrain, dotted with sparse scrub pines and some low scrubs. The climate is unforgivingly continental. May brings in some very hot days and some freezing nights, while July and August see daytime highs exceeding 38 degrees Celsius. In American units, that's 100 Fahrenheit. Swarms of mosquitoes and massive horseflies necessitate netting in the summer. Rainfall is rather scarce, but dense morning fogs are common in August. Come September, temperatures plummet, with heavy snows by October and midwinter lows dipping to negative 34 degrees. It's a blend of North African aridity and North Dakotan winters, supported only by sparse populations, mainly two related but distinct Mongol tribes. The Buryat, or Barga, Mongols migrated into the Nomonhan area from the northwest in the late 17th to early 18th centuries, likely fleeing Russian expansion after the 1689 Treaty of Nerchinsk. Organized by the Manchu emperors between 1732 and 1735, they settled east of the river that they called Khalkhin Gol, the Mongol word for river. in the lands that would become Manchukuo. The Khalkhin Mongols, named for the word meaning barrier or shield, traditionally guarded the Mongol Empire's northern frontiers. Their territories lay west of the Buryats, in what would become the MPR. For centuries, these tribes herded livestock across the sands, river crossings, and desert paths, largely oblivious to any formal borders. For hundreds of years, the line dividing the Mongolian salient from western Manchuria was a hazy administrative divide within the Qing Empire. In the 20th century, Russia's detachment of Outer Mongolia and Japan's seizure of Manchuria transformed this vague boundary into a front line between rival powers. The Nomonhan Incident ignited over this contested border. Near the salient's northeastern edge, the river, called Khalkhin Gol by the Mongols and Soviets, and the Halha by the Manchurians and Japanese, flowed northwest into Lake Bynor. The core dispute was the river, as the Japanese asserted, the historic boundary between Manchukuo and the MPR. Soviet MPR officials insisted the line ran parallel to about 12 miles east of the river, claiming the intervening strip. Japan cited no fewer than 18 maps from Chinese and Japanese sources to support the river as the official border, a logical choice in such a barren terrain, where it served as a sole natural divider. Yet the Soviets and Mongolians countered with evidence, such as the 1919 Chinese Postal Atlas and maps from Japanese and Manchukuoan agencies. But unbeknownst to the combatants, in July of 1939, China's military attaché in Moscow shared a 1934 General Staff map with his American counterpart, showing the border east of the river. Post-war Japanese studies of 18th century Chinese records confirmed that in 1734, the Qing Emperor set a boundary between the Buryats and the Khalkhin Mongols east of the river, passing through the hamlet of Nomonhan, as the Soviets had claimed. However, Kwantung Army headquarters dismissed this as non-binding, viewing it as an internal Qing affair without Russian involvement. Two former Kwantung Army officers offer a pragmatic explanation. From 1931 to 1935, when Soviet forces in the Far East were rather weak, Japanese and Manchukuoan authorities imposed the river as the de facto border, with the MPR acquiesce. By the mid to late 1930s, as Soviet strength grew, Japan refused to yield, while Mongolians and Soviets rejected the river line, sparking clashes. In 1935, the Kwantung Army revised its maps to align with the river claim. From late that year, the Lake Bois-Noir-Hala sector saw frequent skirmishes between Manchukuoan and MPR patrols. Until mid-1938, frontier defenses in northwestern Manchukuo fell to the 8th Border Garrison Unit, based near Helar. This 7,000-man force, spread rather thin, lacked mobility, training, and, in the Kwantung Army's eyes, combat readiness. That summer, the newly formed 23rd Division, under the Kwantung Army, took station at Helar, absorbing the 8th BGU under its command, led by Lieutenant General Michitaro Kometsubara. At the age of 52, Kometsubara was a premier Russian specialist in the Imperial Army, with stints as military attaché in the USSR and head of the Kwantung Special Services Agency in Harbin. Standing at 5'7", with a sturdy build, glasses, and a small mustache, he was a detail-oriented guy who was keeping meticulous diaries, writing lengthy letters, and he composed poetry on the side, though he lacked combat experience. Before departing Tokyo in July of 1938, Kometsubara received briefings from Colonel Masazumi Inada, the Army General Staff Operations Section Chief. Amidst planning for Changkufeng, Inada urged calm on the Manchukuo MPR border, given China's ongoing campaigns. The guidelines: ignore minor incidents, prioritize intelligence on Soviet forces east of Lake Baikal, and study operations against the Soviet Far East Western sector. Familiar with the region from his Harbin days, Kometsubara adopted a low-key approach. Neither impulsive nor aggressive, he kept the rather green 23rd Division near Helar, delegating patrols to the 8th BGU. Then an autumn incident underscored his restraint. On November 1st of 1938, an 8th BGU patrol was ambushed by an MPR force. Per Japanese accounts, the three-man team, led by a lieutenant, strayed too close to the border and was attacked 50 meters inside Manchukuo. The lieutenant escaped, but his men died. Kometsubara sent an infantry company to secure the site, but forbade any retaliation. He pursued body recovery diplomatically, protested to the MPR and the Soviet officials, and disciplined his officers. Garrison leaders got 5 days confinement for poor troop training. The lieutenant, 30 days. Despite this caution, pressures at the Army General Staff and the Kwantung HQ were mounting, poised to thrust the 23rd Division into a fierce battle. Modern militaries routinely develop contingency plans against potential adversaries, and the mere existence of such strategies doesn't inherently signal aggressive intentions. That said, shifts in Japan's operational planning, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, may have inadvertently fueled the Nomonhan Incident. From 1934 to 1938, Japanese war scenarios emphasize a massive surprise assault in the Usuri region, paired with defensive holding actions in northwestern Manchuria. However, between mid-1938 and early 1939, a clandestine joint task force formed by the Army General Staff and the Kwantung Army's operation departments, which crafted a bold new blueprint. This revised strategy proposed containing Soviet forces in the east and north while unleashing a full-scale offensive from Helar, advancing west-northwest towards Chita, and ultimately Lake Baikal. The goal? Sever the Trans-Baikal Soviet Far East from the USSR's core. This was dubbed Plan 8B, and it gained the Kwantung Army's endorsement in March of 1939. And I can't state how batshit insane it is. For those who are interested in the history of Japan's plans of how they would invade the USSR on the cusp of World War II, you can go check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account and look for the specific episode, What If Hokushinran actually happened? That being, what if Japan decided to invade the USSR instead of what they did in our history? I assure you, it's actually very fascinating and there is a lot of information on the planning. But I desist. Key architects, Colonels Tokushiro Hattori and Masuyo Terada, along with Major Takahiro Shimonaki, were reassigned from the Army General Staff to the Kwantung Army headquarters to oversee implementation. The plan anticipated a 5-year build-up before execution, with Hattori assuming the role of Chief Operations Staff Officer. A map review exposes a glaring vulnerability in Plan 8B. The Japanese advance would leave its southern flank exposed to Soviet counterstrikes from the Mongolian salient. By spring 1939, Kwantung HQ likely began perceiving this protrusion as a strategic liability. Notably, at the outbreak of the Nomonhan hostilities, no detailed operational contingencies for that area had been formalized. Concurrently, Japan initiated plans for a vital railroad linking Harlun-Arshan to Helar. While its direct tie to Plan 8B remains rather unclear, the route skirted perilously close to the Hala River, potentially highlighting the Kwantung HQ's focus on the disputed Mongolian salient. In early 1939, the 23rd Division intensified reconnaissance patrols near the river. Around this time, General Grigory Stern, freshly appointed commander of the Soviet Far Eastern Forces, issued a public warning that Japan was gearing up for an assault on the Mongolian People's Republic. As Plan 8B took shape and railroad proposals advanced, Kwantung HQ issued a strikingly confrontational set of guidelines for frontier troops. These directives, often cited as a catalyst for the Nomonhan clash, forged a chain linking the 1937 Amur River Incident, the 1938 Changkufeng debacle, and the 1939 conflict. Resentment had festered at the Kwantung HQ over the perceived Army General Staff meddling during the Amur affair, which curtailed their command autonomy. This frustration intensified at Changkufeng, where Sutaka's 19th Division endured heavy losses, only for the contested Manchurian territory to be effectively ceded over. The Kwantung Army lobbied successfully to wrest oversight of the Changkufeng salient from the Joseon Army. In November of 1938, Major Masanobu Tsuji of the Kwantung HQ's operational section was sent to survey the site. The audacious officer was dismayed. Soviet forces dominated the land from the disputed ridge to the Tumen River. Tsuji undertook several winter reconnaissance missions. His final outing in March of 1939 involved leading 40 men to Changkufeng's base. With rifles slung non-threateningly, they ascended to within 200 yards of the Soviet lines, forming a line and urinating in unison, eliciting amused reactions from the enemy. They then picnicked with bentos and sake, sang some army tunes, and left gifts of canned meat, chocolates, and whiskey. This theatrical stunt concealed Tsuji's real aim: covert photography proving Soviet fortifications were encroaching on Manchurian soil. Tsuji was a singular figure. Born of modest means, he embodied a modern samurai ethos, if one calls the bastardization of the samurai ethos at that time anything but, channeling a sharp intellect into a frail, often ailing body through feats of extraordinary daring. A creative tactician, he thrived in intelligence operations, political scheming, aerial scouting, planning, and frontline command, excelling across a very tumultuous career. He had many flaws, and it marred a small brilliance behind him, and he was quite a bigot. He was really racist for his time, and he had a hell of a capacity for cruelty. Just listen to any of my work about the Malayan campaign and what he did, supposedly under General Yamashita, although General Yamashita had no idea. Now, Tsuji wielded outsized influence via gakukujo, Japan's tradition of subordinates steering policy from below. In 1939, he was a major, but his pivotal role in the Nomonhan Incident stemmed from this dynamic. Back in Xinjiang, after his Changkufeng escapade, Tsuji drafted a response plan: negotiate border rectification with the Soviets. If talks failed, launch an attack to expel the intruders. The Kwantung Army adopted it. Deputy Chief of Staff Major General Otseburo Yano flew to Tokyo with Tsuji's photos, seeking the Army General Staff's approval. And there he was rebuffed. Changkufeng was deemed settled, and minor violations should be overlooked amidst Tokyo's aversion to Soviet conflict. Yano's plea that leniency would invite aggression was countered by notes on Europe's tensions restraining Moscow. Yano's return sparked outrage at the Kwantung HQ, seen as Army General Staff thwarting their imperial duty to safeguard Manchuria. Fury peaked in the operations section, setting the stage for Tsuji drafting a stringent new frontier guideline. This was titled Principles for the Settlement of the Soviet-Manchurian Border Disputes, and the core tenet read, if Soviet troops transgress the Manchurian frontiers, the Kwantung Army will nip their ambitions in the bud by completely destroying them. There were specific directives for local commanders to, quote, if the enemy crosses the frontiers, annihilate him without delay, employing strength, carefully built beforehand. To accomplish our mission, it is permissible to enter Soviet territory, or to trap or lure Soviet troops into Manchurian territory, and allow them to remain there for some time. Where boundary lines are not clearly defined, area defense commanders will, upon their own initiative, establish boundaries and indicate them to the forward elements. In the event of an armed clash, fight until victory is won, regardless of relative strengths or of the location of the boundaries. If the enemy violates the borders, friendly units must challenge him courageously and endeavor to triumph in their zone of action, without concerning themselves about the consequences, which will be the responsibility of higher headquarters. Major Tsuji Matsunobu later justified the new guidelines by pointing to the contradictory orders that had hamstrung frontier commanders under the old rules. They were tasked with upholding Manchuria's territorial integrity, yet forbidden from actions that might spark conflict. This, Tsuji argued, bred hesitation, as officers feared repercussions for decisive responses to incursions. The updated directives aimed to alleviate this anxiety, empowering local leaders to act boldly without personal liability. In truth, Tsuji's principles for the settlement of Soviet-Manchurian border disputes was more incendiary than conciliatory. They introduced provocative measures, authorizing commanders to unilaterally define unclear boundaries, enforce them with immediate force, and, quote, shoot first, ask questions later, permit pursuits in enemy territory, and even encourage luring adversaries across the line. Such tactics flouted both government policy and official army doctrine, prioritizing escalation over restraint. The proposal sparked intense debate within the Kwantung Army's operational section. Section Chief Colonel Takeshiro Hattori and Colonel Masao Terada outranked Tsuji, as did Major Takaharu Shimanuki, all recent transfers from the Army General Staff. Tsuji, however, boasted longer tenure at the Kwantung Army headquarters since April of 1936 and in operation since November of 1937, making him the de facto veteran. Hattori and Terada hesitated to challenge the rather assertive major, whose reputation for intellect, persuasion, and deep knowledge of Manchuria commanded respect. In a 1960 interview, Shimanuki recalled Tsuji's dominance in discussions where his proactive ideas often swayed the group. Unified, the section forwarded Tsuji's plan to the Kwantung Army Command. Commander Lieutenant General Kikichi Yarada consulted Chief of Staff General Rensuke Isogai and Vice Chief General Otseburo Yano, seasoned leaders who should have spotted the guidelines' volatility. Yet lingering grudges from the Army General Staff's interference in the past incidents like the Amur River and Changkufeng Incident clouded their judgment. Yurei Isogai and Toiji shared history from the 1932 Shanghai Incident as well. Toiji, then a captain, led a company in the 7th Regiment under Colonel Isogai, with Yano as his staff officer and Yurada commanding the 9th Division. Toiji was wounded there, forging bonds of camaraderie. And this little clique grew to include Hattori, Terada, Shumanuki, and it amplified Tsuchi's influence. Despite Isogai's initial reservations as the group's moderate voice, the guidelines won approval. Yude issued them as the Kwantung Army's Operation Order 1488 on April the 25th of 1939 during a division commanders' conference. A routine copy reached the Army General Staff in Tokyo, but no formal reply came. Too preoccupied with the China War, the alliance talks with Germany, the Army General Staff may have overlooked the border matters altogether. Colonel Masuzumi Inada, the Army General Staff Operations Head, later noted basic acceptance of Order 1488 with an informal expectation, relayed to Hattori and Terada, a prior consultation on violations. The Kwantung HQ dismissed this altogether as another Tokyo intrusion on their autonomy. Some Japanese analysts contend a sterner Army General Staff rejection might have prevented the Nomonhan Incident from happening, though quelling the Kwantung Army's defiance would have required massive staff resignations, a disruption step the Army General Staff wanted to avoid. Toiji would argue that had they been permitted to be more forceful at Changkufeng, this would have deterred a Nomonhan Incident altogether. Undeniably, Order 1488 paved the way for a conflict 3 weeks later. Japanese records confirm that the Khalkhin Mongols and the MPR patrols routinely crossed the Hala River, viewed by them as an internal territory, 10 miles from the true border. Such crossings passed uneventfully in March and April of 1939. Post-Order 1488, however, the 23rd Division Commander, General Michitaro Komatsubara, responded aggressively, setting the stage for escalation. The Nomonhan Incident ignited with a border clash on May the 11th of 1939, and this rapidly spiraled into a major conflict. Over a dozen authoritative accounts exist, varying in viewpoint, focus, and specifics. After cross-referencing these sources, a coherent timeline emerges, however. On the night of May the 11th, a 20-man Mongolian People's Republic border patrol crossed eastward over the Hala River, known also as Khalkhin Gol, to the Mongols and the Soviets. About 10 miles east, atop a 150-foot sandy hill, lay the tiny hamlet of Nomonhan, a cluster of crude huts housing a few Mongol families. Just south flowed the Holston River, merging westward into the broader Hala. By morning, on May the 11th, Manchurian forces spotted the MPR patrol north of the Holston and west of Nomonhan. In the MPR Soviet perspective, the Nomonhan Hill marked the Mongolian-Manchurian border. To Manchurians and the Japanese, it sat 10 miles inside Manchukuo, well east of Halha. A 40-man Manchurian cavalry unit repelled the Mongolians back across the river, inflicting initial casualties on both sides. The Manchurians drew first blood. The MPR patrol leader exaggerated the attackers as being 200 strong. The next day, on May the 12th, a 60-man MPR force under Major Jogdan evicted the Manchurians from the disputed zone, re-establishing positions between the Halha and Nomonhan. The Manchurians, in turn, reported facing 700 enemies. Sporadic skirmishes and maneuvering persisted throughout the week. On May the 13th, 2 days post-clash, the local Manchurian commander alerted General Michitaro Komatsubara's 23rd Division headquarters in Heilar. Simultaneously, Major Jogdan reported to the Soviet military command in Ulaanbaatar, that being Mongolia's capital. What began as a Mongolian-Manchurian spat was poised to draw in the Soviets and the Japanese. Attributing to that night's violation, which hinged on border interpretations, both sides claimed the Halha-Nomonhan Strip. Yet most accounts concur that the Manchurian forces initiated the fighting in the first place. Post-May 13th notifications to Moscow and Tokyo clarified the record thereafter. Midday on the 13th, Komatsubara was leading a staff conference on the newly issued Kwantung Army Operations Order 1488. Major Tsuji Masanobu's aggressive border guidelines. Ironically, the first Nomonhan combat report arrived mid-discussion. Officers present recall Komatsubara deciding instantly to, quote, destroy the invading outer Mongolian forces, per Order 1488. So that afternoon he informed the Kwantung Army headquarters of the incident and his intent to eradicate the intruders, requesting air support trucks. General Kenkichi Yada, the Kwantung commander, approved Komatsubara's positive attitude, dispatching 6 scout planes and 40 fighters, 10 light bombers, 2 anti-aircraft batteries, and 2 motorized transport companies. Yada added a caveat: to exercise extreme caution to prevent escalation, which is quite a paradoxical blend of destruction and restraint, reflecting the Kwangtung's fervent mood. Yada relayed the details to Tokyo Army General Staff, which responded that the Kwantung Army should handle it appropriately. Despite the Kwantung Army's impulsive reputation, Tokyo deferred, perhaps trusting the northern strategic imbalance. 8 Japanese divisions were facing about 30 Soviet ones, from Lake Baikal to Vladivostok, so they just assumed the Kwantung Army wasn't that crazy. On May the 14th, Major Tsuji flew from the Kwantung HQ for some aerial reconnaissance over Nomonhan, spotting 20 horses but no troops. Upon landing, a fresh bullet hole in his plane confirmed lingering MPR presence east of Hala. Tsuji briefed the 23rd Divisional Staff and reported to Yada that the incident seemed rather minor. Aligning with Order 1488 spirit, Komatsubara deployed a force under Lieutenant Colonel Yaso Azuma, an armored car company, 2 infantry companies, and a cavalry troop. Arriving at Nomonhan on the 15th, Azuma learnt most MPR forces had retreated westward across Halha the prior night, with only token elements remaining, and even they were withdrawing. Undeterred, he pursued them. The advance met scant resistance as foes crossed the river. However, Japanese light bombers struck a small MPR concentration on the western bank. Designated Outpost No. 7 killed about 2 men and wounded 15 per MPR reports. The Japanese would claim 30 to 40 kills. All agreed the raid targeted undisputed MPR territory. Hearing of May the 15th's events, Komatsubara deemed the Mongolians sufficiently rebuked and recalled Azuma to Helar on the 16th. The Kwantung HQ concurred, closing the matter altogether. The Soviet leaders, however, saw it very differently. Mid-May prompted Soviet support for the MPR under their 1936 Mutual Defense Pact. The Red Army's 57th Corps, stationed in Mongolia, faced initial disarray. Commander Nikolai Ferlenko was hunting at the time. His chief of staff, Khrushchev, in Ulan-Ude, was with his ill wife. Moscow learned of the clashes via international press from Japanese sources, sparking Chief of Staff Boris Shpochnikov's furious inquiry. Ferlenko and Khrushchev rushed back to Ulaanbaatar, dispatching a mixed force, which was a battalion from the 149th Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division, plus some light armor and artillery from the 11th Tank Brigade, to Tamsag-Bolak, roughly 80 miles west of Halha. They were led by Major Blyukher, and they were bolstered by the MPR 6th Cavalry Division. Blyukher and the cavalry commander, Colonel Shaibu, inspected the site on the 15th. Cavalry arrived 2 days later, backed by Blyukher, who was ordered to remain west of the river and to avoid combat if possible. Now, some MPR troops recrossed, occupying the disputed zone. Because of course they did. Clashes with Manchurian cavalry resumed, and it intensified. Notified of renewed hostilities, Komatsubara viewed it as defiance, a personal affront. And emboldened by Order 1488, he aimed not to just repel, but to encircle and annihilate. The incident was on the verge of a major expansion. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Now, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 33 episodes and ongoing at this point, early access to content and making voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. The ghosts of the Changkufeng Incident have come back to haunt both the USSR and Japan. Those like Soichi Matsunobu instigated yet again another border clash that would erupt into a full-blown battle that would set a precedent for both nations until the very end of World War II.